At 83, Eddie Levert's tragedy leaves the world speechless. At 83 years old, Eddie Levert has buried more people than some entire families, including 3 of his own children. Yet the world still expects him to smile and sing Love Train like nothing ever happened. This isn't just a music story. It's the brutal question: how much pain can one black man carry before it breaks him? Tonight on Legends of Black Excellence, we're pulling back the curtain on the beautiful, terrifying truth behind the legend. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and drop A in the comments if you're ready to hear the part of his story the spotlight never shows. From Alabama dirt to soul royalty, at 83, the sorrow surrounding Eddie Levert makes his survival feel almost unreal, and to understand why, you have to start where his story began. Long before the spotlight, he was just a little boy in Bessemer, Alabama, born on June 16, 1942, in a wooden house that leaked when the rain came. His father spent his days in the steel mill's lungs, full of dust and muscles burning from endless shifts. His mother scrubbed other people's floors and washed their clothes until her fingers split. Some nights there was so little to eat that she broke a single slice of bread in 2, quietly giving him the bigger half and whispering, "Eat, baby." "I'm not hungry," even when he knew she was lying. On those days, the world outside treated him as if he were invisible. School was not a refuge, but another place where shame waited classmates noticing his worn-out shoes, teachers expecting nothing from a poor black child in the Jim Crow South. What no one saw was the fire beginning to build in his chest. That small Baptist congregation near his home became the one space that didn't judge him by what he wore or what he lacked. His mother nudged him forward in the pews and urged him to sing like he meant every word. Inside that wooden sanctuary, his voice rose above the creaking boards and the tired sighs of working people turning hurt into something almost holy. When he was 6, his parents made the bravest and most desperate choice of their lives. They packed what little they possessed into an unreliable truck and joined the Great Migration, heading north to Canton, Ohio, chasing rumors of steady wages and a more human life. The journey was harsh, sleeping at gas stations, sharing food with strangers, praying the engine would start again each morning. Canton was not the paradise they imagined. Winters there cut through thin clothing, and the boy who once ran barefoot on red Alabama soil now walked icy streets in shoes that let in snow and water. His father's back bent further under factory labor. His mother's hands never truly healed. In that cold northern town, singing stopped being a pastime and became a lifeline. The church choir gave him structure, purpose, and a reason to stand tall when hunger and humiliation tried to crush him. As a teenager, he joined friends to form little neighborhood groups that would eventually evolve into the Triumphs and the Mascots, rehearsing in garages that smelled of oil and metal. Their microphones were broomsticks. Their stages were living rooms and basements, but each harmony was a quiet act of defiance against a world that had told him he was nothing. That is why, at 83, when people talk about the tragedy in Eddie Levert's life, it isn't only about the losses he faced later. The heartbreak began in childhood, born into scarcity, saved only by a voice powerful enough to drag him and eventually millions of others out of the dark. Building. The OJ's dreams in a rusted car, in the long shadow of the heartbreak he carries at 83. There was a time when Eddie Levert's sorrow hadn't yet arrived, only hunger and stubborn ambition. As a young man, he and his closest ally, Walter Williams, chased music wherever it might echo back at them. After long days in ordinary jobs, they would huddle with Bobby Massey, Bill Isles, and later William Powell, shaping rough melodies into tight harmonies. They weren't stars, just hopeful kids in second-hand suits borrowing living rooms, basements, and school gyms to rehearse until their voices were hoarse and their dreams felt almost possible. Their touring fleet was usually one beat-up car that coughed more smoke than power. They'd pack in suits, borrowed instruments, and a tangle of hopes, then drive through the night to tiny bars and social halls. Sometimes the pay barely covered fuel. Sometimes it didn't. They slept sitting up, heads against windows, waking to scrape frost from the windshield before another cheap gig. Yet, inside those cramped spaces, magic kept happening. Walter's smooth tenor, William's precise harmonies, Bobby's steady presence, Bill's grounding energy, and Eddie's raw, burning lead fused into something that felt larger than any one of them. They called themselves the Triumphs, then the mascots, sending demo tapes to any label address they could find. Replies when they came were often knife-sharp, too rough, too regional, not commercial. Most envelopes never came back at all. Still, the group refused to fold. Late one night, after yet another dismissive response, someone suggested a new identity inspired by a Cleveland disc jockey who had given them precious airtime. They adopted a name in his honor, the OJs. It was a small change on paper, but for them, it felt like a declaration they weren't just local boys with a hobby anymore. They were a unit, a mission, a band. The turning point arrived when King Records in Cincinnati finally opened its doors to them. The contract wasn't glamorous and the budget was thin, but it was real. In a modest studio under fluorescent lights and nervous excitement, they cut early sides that hinted at the greatness to come. Those records didn't storm the charts yet. They proved something vital. The sound Eddie and his brothers had carved out in garages and back rooms belonged on vinyl. That first fragile foothold would eventually lead them toward Philadelphia, toward hit records, and tragically toward a future where Eddie would stand almost alone, the last keeper of those early freezing car dreams. Fame, fortune, and the hidden cost of success. At 83, when people look back and say the tragedy of Eddie Levert is beyond heartbreaking, part of that sadness comes from knowing how high he once flew. After years of struggling in obscurity, he and the OJs finally landed the deal that changed everything, a contract with Philadelphia International Records in the early 1970s. Overnight, the group stepped into a new universe of lush arrangements, tight production, and songs that sounded like the heartbeat of an era. Backstabbers exploded, first a slick, warning-filled anthem that turned them from regional favorites into national forces. Then Love Train roared across airwaves, transforming Eddie's impassioned delivery and the group's harmonies into a global sing-along for unity and joy. With each release, their profile grew. For the Love of Money, with its ominous bass line and sharp lyrics, cemented them as more than entertainers. They were commentators' voices for working people and street wisdom. Night after night, the quartet walked onto stages packed with 20,000 faces, lights flaring, brass blasting, choreography tight. From television appearances to sold-out arenas, the world finally acknowledged the power they had been building in those forgotten garages. For a few shining years, it looked like the boy who once sang just to drown out hunger had conquered every room he entered. But success came with a cruel, relentless tempo. The calendar filled with more than 200 performances a year, crisscrossing countries, until days blurred into airports, hotel lobbies, and dressing rooms. Eddie drove his instrument to the edge, pushing his voice through colds, fatigue, and strain, because audiences expected the same fire every night. Walter Williams and the others held their own under that pressure, yet even among so much applause, there was very little rest. When the curtain dropped and the quiet returned, exhaustion wrapped around them heavier than the stage costumes they peeled off. Worse still, the money didn't match the roar of the crowds. Contracts written in fine print funneled much of the revenue elsewhere toward executives, middlemen, people who never sweated under the spotlight. Royalty statements didn't reflect sold-out tours, and legal language disguised missing income. While gold records lined walls, bank accounts often told a harsher story. In the midst of this grind, tragedy struck the group itself. William Powell, whose voice had anchored their harmonies, fell gravely ill and died in 1977. Losing him cut into the very fabric of their sound. For Eddie, that era became a bittersweet memory, glory built on overwork, underpayment, and the permanent absence of a brother he could never replace. The love he lost. Martha and a family torn apart. By the time Eddie Levert reached the age of 83, the heartbreak people saw in his eyes had roots that went all the way back to his very first home life as a husband and young father. Long before he was introduced as a legend, he was simply a rising singer in a modest suit, trying to balance dreams and responsibility. In the mid-1960s, he met Martha Bird, a woman who didn't fall for the celebrity he would become, but for the determined, soft-spoken man struggling to make a way. She believed in his promise before the world even knew his name, and that faith felt like a miracle to a man who had grown up feeling unseen. Their wedding joined two people who had little money, but enormous hope. They set up house in a small place that creaked in winter, a starter home where the wallpaper peeled, but laughter made every room feel full. In 1966, their first son, Gerald, arrived a baby cradled to sleep by lullabies Eddie hummed after late rehearsals. 2 years later, Sean was born lively and bright, the kind of child who filled the space between them with movement and noise. For a brief, shining window, they had what many only dream about: a close, noisy family held together by music jokes in the kitchen and quiet promises whispered over sleeping children. Then success demanded its price. As the OJs climbed higher, travel schedules grew brutal. Eddie spent more nights in hotels and buses than at his own kitchen table. Tours overlapped recording sessions. Interviews ate into the little time left. Martha stayed behind with 2 growing boys, handling school pickups, doctor visits, and bills, while he chased the momentum that finally put food in the cupboards. Phone calls got shorter, visits home came less often, and when he did slip through the door at 3 in the morning, he sometimes found her asleep on the couch, exhausted from a day spent holding everything together. The distance between them didn't explode in one argument. It grew like a slow crack no one knew how to seal. By the time the marriage ended, there were no dramatic scenes, just a quiet signing of papers and the sound of lives splitting in two. The legal documents used the word divorce, but for Eddie it felt more like losing a tribe. The house, the daily rituals, the unplanned moments with Gerald and Sean stayed mostly with Martha while he returned to buses, arenas, and dressing rooms. Decades later, standing at 83 with a lifetime of sorrow behind him, that first fracture still haunted him, a reminder that while the world saw his meteoric rise, the real cost was a family that slowly slipped through his fingers while the crowd cheered his name. Raquel and Ryan Eddy's second chance at love. By the time Eddie crossed into the later chapters of his life, long before he was an 83-year-old man carrying unspeakable grief, a quieter miracle slipped into his world. Raquel. She did not arrive with fanfare, awards, or nostalgia. Instead, she came with calm questions, patient listening, and a steadiness he had never fully known. Where earlier years had been full of touring chaos and emotional distance, her presence felt like someone gently turning down the volume on a life that had been loud for too long. She saw not the front man, but the aging man behind the microphone, and loved that version first. Their bond grew slowly, shared dinners, unhurried conversations, moments where he didn't have to perform or prove anything. When they married, it wasn't a spectacle. It was two souls who had been burned by life, promising each other something very simple: I will stay. Morning routines replaced hotel wake-up calls. Instead of packing suitcases, Eddie found himself brewing coffee while Raquel read or prayed nearby their home, filled with soft gospel tunes instead of crowd noise. For a man who had lived on the road, this ordinary rhythm felt almost miraculous. The greatest blessing of this second union was their daughter, Ryan. She arrived like sunlight through a window he thought had permanently closed. Eddie, older and wiser, approached fatherhood differently this time. He lingered over small things, braiding her hair, walking her to school, listening to her teenage jokes about his old-school dance steps. In the evenings, she'd sit in the studio next to him, doodling on lyric sheets while he adjusted vocal lines. He told her stories about two older brothers she never got to grow up with in the same house: Gerald, with the booming charisma, Sean, with the gentle nature, painting them not as myths, but as real young men who loved to laugh, tease, and dream. Inside that home, Raquel stitched everything together. She created a safe place where memories of lost sons and the joy of a late-in-life child could coexist without crushing him. For a while, it seemed as if the universe had finally given Eddie a soft landing, a devoted partner, a bright, affectionate daughter, and a household that felt like true refuge. That is precisely why, viewed from the vantage point of 83, the devastation is so piercing. He didn't simply lose children in time, he lost the very sanctuary that had once convinced him it was still possible to start over and be whole again. Gerald Levert. The golden voice gone too soon. Long before Eddie Levert became an 83-year-old father carrying unbearable sorrow, his oldest boy Gerald shone like proof that all the early sacrifice had meant something. Born in 1966 to Eddie and Martha Bird, Gerald grew up backstage falling asleep in folding chairs while his father sang to half-empty halls. He absorbed every riff, every run until he stepped to the microphone himself. With that rich velvet tone and disarming smile, he didn't just resemble his father, he amplified the gift, turning it into a modern R&B force that stood on its own. As a young man, Gerald formed the group Levert with his brother and a childhood friend, then later joined the super trio LSG, stacking platinum plaques and hit singles. Yet away from chart positions and awards, he remained my boy to Eddie, the son who joked about his dad's old moves, who called just to say, "You still got it, Pops." Their duet, Baby. Hold On to Me was more than a record. In the studio, a quiet producer watched as the father turned his head to hide damp eyes while Gerald delivered the chorus as if he were speaking directly to him through the lyric. When news broke in November 2006 that Gerald had died suddenly at just 40, the shock rippled far beyond the family. Martha Bird Levert, who had nursed scraped knees and teenage heartbreak, now faced the unthinkable. A mother choosing a casket instead of a birthday cake. Radio hosts choked up on air announcing his passing. Singers who had toured with him struggled to finish tributes. Fans pulled their cars to the side of the road, stunned that a voice they had grown up with could go silent overnight. The loss was ruled an accidental medication-related death, but for those who loved him, no explanation could touch the ache. The funeral gathered them all in one place. Relatives, musicians, DJs, admirers who had never met him but felt they knew him through songs. A choir began humming "Baby Hold On to Me," and eventually the microphone was placed in Eddie's hand. The man who had carried stadiums with his sound opened his mouth, and nothing came. The grief was too heavy to push past his throat. So the congregation did it for him. Hundreds of trembling voices finishing the melody he and Gerald had once recorded together. From the vantage point of 83, that moment haunts the larger tragedy of Eddie Levert's life, a father whose greatest duet with his firstborn became in the end a song he could no longer bear to sing. Sean Levert. The quiet son silenced by the system. By the time Eddie Levert reached his 80s, people could already see the grief of one son gone. What makes his story truly devastating is that the nightmare repeated itself. His younger boy, Sean, had grown up partly in the glow and partly in the shadow of his big brother, Gerald. Where Gerald blazed with obvious charisma, Sean carried a quieter light, soft-spoken, playful, and often the peacemaker in the family. When the group Levert took shape with childhood friend Mark Gordon, Sean wasn't just a background figure. His gentle, pleading tone gave their records an emotional center that fans immediately felt. Inside that trio, Sean balanced the dynamic. Gerald might push the showmanship. Mark might focus on arrangements, and Sean would slide in with lines that sounded like confession and comfort mixed together. Still, comparisons followed him everywhere. Interviewers, promoters, even listeners would say, "You sound like your father," or "You and your brother are just alike," as if he didn't have his own identity. He loved his family, but that constant measuring took a toll. When Gerald died, it was as if the scaffolding holding up Sean's world suddenly vanished. Friends and relatives noticed the abrupt change. The laughs less frequent, the eyes more distant, the calls to his parents filled with long silences instead of jokes. Then, legal trouble collided with grief. In early 2008, a court sentenced Sean to serve time over unpaid child support. It wasn't a headline-grabbing crime, just a painful, complicated chapter in a life already weighed down. He entered the county facility carrying not only emotional scars but physical vulnerabilities that weren't fully understood or properly managed. Locked doors replaced studio doors. Fluorescent lights replaced stage spots. Eddie planned to visit to talk about rebuilding, maybe even making new music together when it was over. That conversation never happened. Within weeks, Sean's health spiraled. A serious lung condition, blood pressure issues, and abrupt withdrawal from prescribed anxiety medication combined in a way his body could not withstand. News of his passing at only 39 crashed over the family like a second wave before they had even learned to stand after the first. Martha Bird, already shattered by Gerald's loss, now faced another funeral for another child. Investigations reports and a legal settlement followed, with officials acknowledging failures in how Sean's condition had been handled. Money arrived, but Eddie understood that no figure on a check could replace a son's voice. In the spirit of turning pain into purpose, he directed much of that compensation toward scholarships and assistance for struggling households, trying to ensure that Sean's name would be tied to opportunity rather than just tragedy. Standing at 83, he is a father who has not only lost both of his boys, but also watched one slip away under the watch of a system that was supposed to protect him, a wound that makes his story almost unbearable to contemplate. Martha's final chapter. A mother waiting for her boys. In the long story that leaves Eddie Levert standing at 83 with a heart almost worn through the chapter about Martha Bird. Levert is quieter, but no less devastating. After the music industry stopped calling her name, she settled into a modest house in Cleveland, the same place where she had once packed lunches, ironed school clothes, and waited for two boys to come home from class or rehearsal. The gold records on her walls weren't trophies she had chased. They were reminders of nights she'd stayed up praying for their safety, while the world danced to their songs. Inside, that home time seemed to fold back on itself. Gerald's magazine covers leaned against the wall in his old room, his smile forever frozen in mid-laugh. On Sean's desk, unfinished lyric sheets and scribbled ideas stayed exactly where he had left them. Martha rarely moved those items. To outsiders, it might have looked like she couldn't let go. In truth, it was her way of keeping them near. She'd sit by the window in the afternoon radio, playing softly. Sometimes an OJ's track, sometimes one of her son's recordings, and she'd murmur to them as if they were simply in another room just a little too far away to answer. Neighbors caught glimpses of her life in fragments. A small figure sweeping the porch, tending to flowers, exchanging gentle greetings, occasionally laughing with an old friend on the sidewalk. They knew what she had been through, and there was a kind of protective respect around her. People lowered their voices when her name came up the way you do when you're talking about someone who has already endured more than enough. Over the years, her body began to weaken, much like a candle burning down to its final inches. Yet even as walking became slower and breaths more careful, she spoke of her boys as though they were waiting just beyond some invisible doorway, two bright presences she fully expected to see again. In early 2020, that expectation finally felt answered. Martha slipped away in her sleep. No drama, no machines, just a gentle end for a woman who had weathered a lifetime of storms. Her funeral was modest, held in a church that had once echoed with the baptisms of her sons. Friends, relatives, and nearby residents filled a few rows, singing hymns she used to hum over bubbling pots on the stove. When it was time to say goodbye, Eddie stepped forward, older now, carrying more grief than any one person should. He placed a single white rose on her coffin and whispered words only he and God heard. For a man whose tragedy at 83 already defies belief, watching the mother of his children laid to rest and knowing she was finally with Gerald and Sean again added one more layer of ache to a life defined by both extraordinary music and almost unimaginable loss. Ryan Levert, the lupus fighter who broke his heart. By the time this last blow arrived, Eddie Levert was already an old man who had buried more than any parent should. Yet his youngest child, Ryan, had given his later years a brightness he thought was gone for good. She grew up not on tour buses, but in a home shaped by her mother Raquel's calm faith and her father's hard-won tenderness. Quick with jokes, endlessly kind, she teased him about his vintage dance steps and loved calling to tell him when his name was trending online again. To Eddie, she wasn't just a daughter. She was proof that life could still surprise him with joy. That fragile happiness began to crack when strange symptoms appeared. Ryan felt tired all the time, bruises showed up without explanation, and her joints ached like someone much older. After rounds of tests and anxious hours in sterile corridors, doctors finally named the enemy lupus, a ruthless autoimmune disorder. Hospitals replaced concert venues in Eddie's routine. He sat by her bed, fingers laced around hers, listening to monitors instead of applause. She refused to sink into self-pity, posting about her condition with humor and courage, calling herself a fighter, and promising friends she was still grateful, still hopeful, still laughing. As 2024 drew toward its end, her body could no longer match her spirit's resilience. December nights outside the medical center were strung with holiday lights, but inside the room, the decorations felt almost cruel. Machines beeped softly while Raquel prayed at the foot of the bed, and Eddie whispered stories about when she was small, how she used to doodle on his lyric sheets. Her breathing grew shallow, pauses stretching longer between each inhale. Leaning close, he kissed her forehead and told her she didn't have to keep battling for his sake. When her hand finally relaxed in his, it was as if every previous loss returned at once, crashing through a heart already scarred. The farewell that followed was intimate, filled with purple ribbons and quiet sobs. Sunlight came through stained glass and washed her white casket in color, as if the sky itself was trying to comfort them. Among Ryan's things, Eddie later found a folded note addressed to him in her neat handwriting. "Keep singing, Daddy. I'll be listening." Those words became his new prayer. He channeled his pain into action, supporting lupus research, backing foundations in her name, turning personal devastation into help for strangers facing the same diagnosis. Still at 83, as he walks on stage and whispers his children's names under his breath, it is Ryan's last message that keeps him moving. A reminder that even in the most crushing chapter of his life, his song is the one promise he can still keep to the daughter he lost. Fallen brothers, the OJs and the ghosts on stage. By the time Eddie Levert reached 83, loss didn't just live in his family tree, it stood beside him on stage. In the beginning, the OJs were a pack of young men believing they could sing their way out of every dead end. Eddie, his lifelong ally. Walter Williams Sr., precise and disciplined. William Powell, steady. Bill Isles, fiery. Bobby Massey, later joined by players like Frankie Little Jr., and in another era showman Sammy Strain and younger voice Eric Nolan Grant. To the public, they were just a soul group. To Eddie, they were brothers in everything but blood, the only people who truly understood what it meant to live inside a song. As the years rolled on, that brotherhood thinned. Powell, whose tone once locked their harmonies into place like a compass, fell ill and died of colon cancer in the late 1970s. The blend that fans adored was never quite the same again. A crucial layer had vanished. Bill Isles, one of the original dreamers who helped carry Speaker's book rehearsals and hold morale together in the lean days, later stepped away from the spotlight but never from the shared history. When word came in 2019 that he had passed, Eddie felt another piece of the origin story quietly disappear. Then in 2022, news broke that Bobby Massey, the co-founder who had been there in cramped cars and tiny venues, was gone as well. It wasn't just a roll call of obituaries. It was the slow erasing of the faces from their first group photographs. Some departures were even more haunting. In the early years, guitarist and songwriter Frankie Little Jr. had been part of the evolving lineup, adding riffs and ideas that helped shape their early identity. Then one day, he simply vanished. For decades, there were only rumors. Maybe he moved, maybe he quit music, maybe he built a new life somewhere else. Nearly 40 years later, DNA testing matched unidentified remains found behind a factory to Frankie. That revelation hit Eddie like a delayed thunderclap. A friend had not just drifted away, he had been missing in the most literal, tragic sense all that time. The confirmation brought a kind of bitter closure, the kind that answers one question and opens a dozen more. Today, when Eddie walks under the lights with Walter at his side and colleagues like Sammy and Eric helping carry the set, the audience sees a functioning group. He sees something different. On his left, he remembers the spot where William once stood. On the other side, he can almost picture Bobby tapping his foot. Somewhere in the dark, he imagines Bill's solid presence and Frankie tuning his guitar. At 83, the tragedy isn't only that he has outlived parents and children. It's that he often sings surrounded by ghosts, hearing harmonies from men whose bodies are gone, but whose voices still ring in his memory every time the band launches into Love Train. At 83, what's left when a legend outlives everyone? At 83, Eddie Levert's days no longer revolve around tour buses and endless hotel rooms, but around two places that finally feel like shelter: his house under the desert sun in Las Vegas and his longtime base in Canton, Ohio. The Nevada home with its 4 bedrooms, wide kitchen piano by the window swimming pool, and little patch of green where he practices his golf swing isn't a monument to luxury so much as a refuge for a man who spent decades living out of suitcases. There alongside his wife Raquel, mornings begin slowly, coffee on the patio, light conversation. Maybe a melody hummed under his breath rather than shouted over a crowd. Raquel is the steady rhythm in that quieter life, gently guarding the peace he fought so hard to earn. She reminds him to rest when work calls a little too loudly and shares in his private rituals of remembrance. On days when he travels back to Ohio, the contrast is sharp. Canton holds the memories of struggle and early dreams, but also the roots that never let him forget where he came from. Moving between these two worlds, he carries both comfort and ache, choosing simple routines, cooking short walks, phone calls with old friends over the frantic pace that once defined him. Even now, the stage hasn't completely released him. From time to time, he still appears under the lights standing beside his old comrade, Walter Williams Sr., with Sammy Strain and Eric Nolan Grant adding their energy and voices. The shows are shorter, the travel carefully measured, but when the band starts and the harmonies lock in, there is a flicker of the same electricity that carried them through arenas decades ago. Before the curtain rises, he often pauses backstage and quietly says the names Gerald, Sean, and Ryan, imagining them blending in from somewhere beyond the footlights, as if the group has invisible members the audience can't see, but he can feel in every chord. Away from the microphone, Eddie pours his remaining strength into impact rather than image. The success he built over 6 relentless decades, those records, tours, and royalties, now helps fuel causes close to his heart. Support for heart health through groups like the American Heart Association, backing for lupus research after Ryan's illness, scholarships, and community programs connected to the Levert Foundation. Sitting at 83 in a house full of photographs and plaques, he knows the heartbreak in his story is almost unbearable. Yet he keeps choosing gratitude over bitterness, using his voice, his resources, and his memories to honor those he's lost. Every time he walks on stage or signs a donation, it is the same message whispered into the world. The pain is unspeakable, but the song and the love behind it will not end with him. At 83, Eddie Levert stands as both a pillar of soul music and a symbol of almost unimaginable loss. He rose from poverty to global stages only to outlive nearly everyone who built his world. Bandmates, his first great love, and 3 beloved children. Yet he still walks into the light, singing for the ones who can't. On Legends of Black Excellence, we've traced the cost behind the legend. Now the question is yours. Is Eddie's story one of tragic survival, quiet victory, or something far more complicated? Tell us what his legacy means to you today and tomorrow.